Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to, good morning, and welcome to our first Minnesota Lake Lookout Project webinar. My name is Hilarie Sorensen. I'm the Water Resources Extension Educator with Minnesota Sea Grant. I'm based out of our Duluth office. And today I'm going to introduce this project very briefly, orient people to what we're doing here, and then I'm going to hand things over to our expert speaker who I'm very excited about. Hilary Dugan is going to speak to us about chloride in lake ecosystems. So, excuse me, moving screens around here so I can see better. Okay. So this is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to do for this project. This one is focusing on chloride. The next one will focus on cyanobacteria blooms or harmful algal blooms. So stay tuned for information about that one. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the project website. That is minnesotalake.lookout.org, and that website will be live soon. We will have time for Q&A after Hilary's presentation. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We won't use the chat today, we'll use the Q&A. And then following today's session, anyone who's registered will receive a follow-up email containing two things. There will be an evaluation for today's session and a Google form for those interested in participating with this project. So if you would like to volunteer or if you have a lake that you think would be a good fit for this effort, we'll send out that form to gather a little bit more information. Okay, so with that, I am going to see if I can change slides here. Oh, apologies, I'm having some. There we go. Okay. So with that, what is Minnesota Lake Lookout all about? So this project is a partnership between the Minnesota Sea Grant and the UMD's University of Minnesota Duluth's Natural Resources Research Institute. This project is funded by the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund as recommended by the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, or LCCMR. We are focusing on two water quality problems. Chloride primarily enters lakes through runoff containing road salt. It's also used in water softeners and agricultural practices. It enters Minnesota waters and negatively affects water quality and aquatic life. Hilary Dugan is going to speak more about this water quality issue in just a few minutes. The second water quality focus area for this project is cyanobacteria, or harmful algal blooms, which also pose serious health risks for humans, pets, and wildlife. So these are two pretty different water quality problems, but they do have a couple of things in common. One is that the runoff that brings chloride and the nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, that contribute to algal blooms into lakes is non-point source and episodic, meaning we don't know when or where a chloride influx will occur or when and where an algal bloom may pop up, and if that algal bloom produces cyanotoxins or what kind of cyanotoxins. So there are a lot of unknowns here. And this unpredictability makes it difficult for agencies and research entities to make it out to take water samples, particularly in more rural areas. So this is really where the power of people comes in, the power of community. So the goal of this project is to collaborate with lake-based communities and organizations to develop a volunteer network to track chloride and cyanobacteria blooms in Minnesota lakes, again, primarily focused in rural areas. So people who are already out on these water bodies and have increased capacity to observe and collect samples. So what is participatory or community science? There are several names that this goes by. Citizen science was used for a long time. Now folks use participatory science or community science more often. And there are multiple benefits to this. One, volunteers really play a central role in scientific discovery, in fostering greater engagement between people and their environment. It offers opportunities for collaboration between researchers and communities to collect, analyze, and interpret data. And as I mentioned before, it can really increase our capacity to collect data, to have more to look at. It's particularly valuable in addressing large scale challenges like environmental monitoring, climate change, or health studies. So that's primarily where it's used. What data will volunteers collect? Well, we'll ask for descriptions, site descriptions, and images from the lakes that you're sampling. We'll also have people collecting surface salinity readings in the field, collecting water samples to send back for later analysis for both chloride concentrations and cyanotoxins. And we'll have rapid test strips for a common cyanotoxin called microcystin for those algal blooms. And we'll ask people to take detailed pictures of an algal bloom if and when you come across them. And then what will we do with the data? So we have built an interactive database for volunteers to be able to access training materials, data sheets, protocols, and upload their lake data. It'll also be a way for volunteers to interact with the project team and track their samples all the way through the analysis phase. Water samples will be analyzed for chloride concentrations at the University of Minnesota Duluth's Large Lakes Observatory, and the cyanotoxin analysis will be conducted at the Natural Resources Research Institute by Chris Philstrup, who is co-PI on this project. And then throughout the project, our main goal is to have volunteer engagement and partner organization engagement through community events and outreach programs. So if you are interested in participating with this project, there will be several different ways to engage that will be shared after this session. You could contact me directly. We will also have that Google Sheet if you are interested in filling that out, and we will post additional information on the project webpage. Okay, with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Hilary Dugan. Hilary is an associate professor at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As a limnologist, Hilary studies how terrestrial and atmospheric changes, such as warming air temperatures or land use patterns, alter biogeochemical fluxes and aquatic processes in lakes. Her research balances field-based programs, which rely heavily on sensor networks, with the use and development of models, and the application of geophysical and geospatial tools. Her research is on temperate and polar lakes with sites spanning from Wisconsin all the way to Antarctica. So with that, welcome, Hilary. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Should be able to share yours.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, I guess I prepared a short presentation, and I am hoping to leave lots of time for questions and answers. Also, with this webinar feature, like feel free to type questions real time. Might answer them real time, so don't hesitate to do that. And yeah, I look forward to sharing with you some information about chloride in lakes. So let's jump in. All right. So yeah, as Hilarie said, I'm a professor at UW-Madison. I work at the Center for Limnology, and I do a lot of work thinking about generally just like long-term change in lake ecosystems. And I guess for the last decade or so, I've been pretty invested in thinking about increasing salinity in freshwater lakes. And in the Midwest, a lot of that comes from road salt. So yeah, thinking about the connection between road salt in watersheds and what's happening to our lakes. So in terms of like the salt life cycle that I think about, some of that is more policy driven. It's happening in the watershed. We think about road salt as a big input. Hilary also mentioned water softeners. So there's different ways that salt gets into our lakes. And then the question is, once it's there, what is it doing? So thinking about the impacts of salt, both on the biology of lakes, but also on the physics. And then, if we are using those lakes for drinking water, for instance, what that might mean for human health as well. So I think a lot about what's happening kind of on the upstream side. Most of my research focuses more on kind of the watershed dynamics and what's happening in the lake. Um, Less so on the organismal side, but work with a lot of people who are asking those questions about, what is it doing to actual aquatic organisms? And I think everyone on this call probably lives in Minnesota. And so we're all familiar with what like road salting is and looks like. And it's a pretty hot topic in the winter, especially if you're in a major urban area. There's been a legacy of I'd say a legacy of like oversalting and kind of promising people really pristine road conditions in the winter. And people have grown accustomed to maybe that level of expectation where the expectation is like there won't be snow on the roads. You can drive quick all winter. And I think I really like this picture. It shows an intersection in Madison. I took it a few years back where the road that's sort of running, I guess like right left across the street is a major county road in the city. And you can see that it's been plowed, but there's still a lot of snow on it. And then the road that's running kind of like into the distance is also a major road. Um, and it clearly has no snow on it. And that's a road that's maintained actually by campus. And here you can see, there's like two very different salting practices being used. One where like they didn't put salt down, and one where they put salt down, and the result is obvious. Salt is really effective at melting snow and ice in a certain temperature range. Um, and there's been a lot of emphasis, I guess, lately on trying to change how we apply road salt. And while there's lots of proponents for that, there's also lots of people who get mad. And I liked this letter to the editor from a couple of winters ago where someone was super mad that Madison was prioritizing the lakes over people. But I think we can do both. I think there's a happy medium here. Okay, so salting is it's been around for a long time, road salting. This is a plot of just like how much salt the United States uses every year. So it's in the sort of 40 to 60 million tons, and pretty much half of that is used for road salt. So of all of the salt that we consume in a year, half of it just is put on our roads. A lot of it is used in the chemical industry. But it's kind of crazy to think that like of all the salt we consume, 50% of it, we're literally just like throwing it into the environment every year. And for a long time, this number was increasing. I actually think about a decade ago, it kind of leveled off. We sort of reached peak salt use, and we're starting to use be a bit like smarter in our management decisions. And even though the population's growing, I think we are seeing at least like a more of like a leveling off in total salt use. So luckily, I don't think this is like continuing to increase, but it's still pretty high. Still use a lot of salt. Um, and in terms of the state, like the Minnesota, Wisconsin, we use about both of our states use about 500,000 tons of salt a year on our roads. And this was a fun article that came out, I think, last year where they compared what 500,000 tons of salt would look like. And it's about the size of US Bank Stadium if you piled all of that up. And so you can imagine that every year that much salt is distributed around the state. And it's clearly it's not distributed equally. So this is not like a random pollutant in the way that other pollutants are more kind of equally dispersed. You can think of like atmospheric pollutants as maybe like affecting all lakes equally. Salt doesn't. It's very localized. It's used much more in urban centers or on interstates. And so geographically, there is a huge variation between the amount of salt that might go into a lake in a city versus the amount of salt that would go into a really, really rural lake. So in some ways, that's good. We can kind of focus our attention on places where there actually is a problem. And it's good because there's lots of lakes that are really not experiencing a problem. So that's also good. That said, there's lots of places where we use, too much salt, and it's every like particle of salt that we put down on our roads or sidewalks, eventually ends up in our our water. So, this salt on this sidewalk, at some point, it's going to rain. In this example, this water is going to go into a local storm sewer, and eventually this salt will flow out into Lake Mendota. So it's easy to kind of see the connection between the pollutant and where it's going. Um, so why does it matter? So first off, salt actually affects the density of lakes. If you were to take like a bucket of fresh water and a bucket of salt water, the salt water is more dense. So it's actually heavier. It's the reason why if you ever like swim in a salty lake, you feel like you're floating more. It's that density effect. So what that means is that if you were to put like a bunch of salt water into a freshwater lake, that salt water being more dense wants to sink to the bottom. And what can happen is that if you get, these big salt pulses coming into a lake, and sinking to the bottom, that bottom layer can become more salty than the surface. They can actually kind of like differentiate into like more fresh water up top and more salty water in the bottom. And what can eventually happen is that if that bottom layer gets too salty, it can actually prevent the lake from like fully mixing, especially in the spring. And this is something that we have seen happen in the Midwest. There's some documented lakes in Michigan where they received so much road salt that they became what we call meromictic, where the bottom is just like not mixing with the surface. Um, and that then creates a problem for habitat, nutrient cycling, a whole lot of things when you're not like fully kind of refreshing that water at the bottom. And the when like predicting when this might happen is pretty lake specific. It really depends on sort of the shape of the lake, how much water's flowing in, how big the lake is for mixing. So the actual concentration of like when this might happen is different between lakes. All right. Also, chemistry matters for organisms living in the water. So we can think of, salt as being a chemical change, and organisms like they need different ions. Ions affect them differently. A good example here I'm showing is calcium, which is a salt. It's a and it's necessary for certain organisms to live. So zebra mussels, for instance, use calcium for their shells. Some lakes actually like don't have enough calcium for zebra mussels to live, which is great. um, so chemistry matters for animals and plants. And the big thing with salt is that all of the species in our Midwest lakes have evolved to live in really fresh water. And what happens if you were to put a like a saltwater fish into fresh water, um, it would it takes up sort of like the surrounding water differently than a fish evolved to fresh water. And so what happens is if you were to put a freshwater fish into saltwater, is water wants to like leave its body and the fish eventually dies from dehydration. If you put a saltwater fish into freshwater, water flows into the body and like the fish swells up and it kills them. And so these fish have evolved to very different habitats. And fish are actually like, because they have organs, they actually are more they're less sensitive than other organisms. Um, there's some sort of smaller organisms, things like native freshwater mussels, some zooplankton, some plants that have been found to be like incredibly sensitive to changes in salinity. So, generally I think like the rule of thumb is like it's these animals evolved to freshwater, so making the lake salty is like not doing them any favors. Okay, so I think if you guys could take anything home from this talk, it's just kind of like what is salinity? Like when we say the word salinity, what do we actually mean? Um, and salinity is basically the mass of what we call inorganic solids or inorganic ions that are dissolved in water. And it's mostly the ones that I'm showing on the screen. So calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. Bicarbonate is HCO3, carbonate is CO3, sulfate is SO4, and chloride is the Cl there. So these are all different elements or molecules that we find dissolved in water. And a lot of these we find just naturally. Sorry, this slideshow apparently has timings and it's like flipping forward. Um, so a lot of these are found naturally in lakes. Down here in southern Wisconsin and southern Minnesota, you just like naturally have a lot of calcium. So if you were to um, measure all of these ions and add them up, that is your total salinity. And so just naturally, like lakes have different salinity based on their geology. So lakes in southern Wisconsin and southern Minnesota naturally have higher salinity than lakes in northern Minnesota or northern Wisconsin, just based on like the bedrock and the soil in that region. And so a lot of these ions, again, are found naturally. Things like calcium here in Madison, we have tons of calcium in our water. However, there are some of these ions that are not found naturally in a lot of our lakes around here. And one of those is chloride, the Cl down there, and also sodium, the Na. And sodium and chloride are what we usually, that's like the salt that we usually use on our roads. There are other forms of salt we use for road salt, but usually it's sodium chloride. Um, and so while there's like lots of natural ions in lakes, usually when we see elevated chloride concentrations, it's from humans. Like there's just like not a lot of background chloride in lakes in our states. So the challenge here though is like there are natural salts, there's human derived salts, and also to actually measure salinity, you have to measure all of these ions and add them up. So you have to like this is another diagram just showing if you're like familiar with the periodic table of elements. Salts are found in different places. And when we say salinity, we just like add up those concentrations. And so we actually just measure like the total grams of salt in a liter of water. So the unit of salinity is usually grams per liter. And that's as simple as it sounds. You would like have those ions, you measure their weight in grams, how many of them are in a liter of water. And this is a diagram that attempts to show kind of what the range of salinity is in waters on Earth. On the far right, 35 grams per liter is about average ocean water salinity. And the ocean is also mostly sodium and chloride. Um, and on the left is zero, which would be like, you know, pure water. And fresh water, what we normally call fresh water, is usually below 1 gram per liter of salt. Generally, we actually try and maintain drinking water below 0.5 grams per liter, so 500 milligrams per liter. And so the range of fresh water is obviously very different than the range for salt water. And then everything in between, this range from like 1 to 30, we call either like subsaline or brackish. It's sort of this like intermediate between, freshwater and the ocean. And then we can actually have like lakes that are way saltier than the ocean. We call those hypersaline. But for the purpose of this talk, we're kind of like in this like less than one range. Less than 1 gram per liter of total salt is what we could consider fresh water. And to actually like measure all of those ions is a lot of work. Because you have to measure them individually and then add up the total salinity. Sorry about the slides. We do this in a lab. This is a picture of an ion chromatograph. I'm not going to get into details, but like we can measure all of these ions individually and calculate the total sum, and that's our total salinity. Clearly, that's a lot of work to do that. So what we often use are sensors that can give us an estimate of salinity based on what we call specific conductance or electrical conductivity. This is a picture of one that I use. You can see I'm kind of holding like a metal stick on the left, and there's a readout there. And electrical conductivity is going to give us like a estimate of salinity. And that estimate is because basically like as water gets saltier, it conducts electricity more easily. So we can take advantage of that property and use a sensor to tell us what the conductivity of the water is based on like how easily it can conduct electricity. And these sensors are nice because you can just stick them in a lake and it can tell you the conductivity. And then if we know something about that lake, we can then like relate that reading to salinity, um, which is a whole lot easier than taking water samples and measuring all of those ions. If we just want like a pretty good estimate, we can use these sensors. Um, so again, we can use these sensors to measure total salinity, but we also kind of know that humans are mostly uh, polluting the water with sodium and chloride. Um, so what we can do is we can also take a water sample and like just measure chloride, and that will give us a pretty good idea of like what the impact is from road salt. So instead of measuring all these ions, we just measure like just the sodium and chloride or just the chloride. And chloride's a really nice ion to measure because like there's just like nothing's really happening with it in a lake. Like nothing is taking it up or using it. It's just sort of like staying dissolved in the water. Um, and it's the reason that the ocean is so full of chloride. It's because like nothing is using it. It's just staying dissolved in the ocean. So what we can do is this is an example of a couple like students out sampling water. We like take up, suck up water, lake water into a syringe. We can pass it through a filter just to get rid of like the particulates. Then we can take it back to the lab and measure it for chloride. And then once, we're in the lab, again, we can run it through a lab machine and get the chloride concentration. Um, so what's nice is like if you do both of these, as Hilary mentioned, you can use both a sensor to measure that conductivity, and you can also take a water sample to measure chloride to kind of give you a sense of what's happening. And what we see, like generally in the Midwest, is if we have lakes or ponds near roads that are being salted, they have been getting saltier over time. So this is data from the lakes in Madison, where I live, where we can see the chloride concentration. So again, this is just chloride going up through time. So back in the 40s, it was actually pretty close to zero. Um, and since then, it's sort of steadily increased. Um, and we get some big swings in wet years. It decreases because, lots of rain kind of flushes that chloride downstream. And in drought years, or in like, really snowy years where we use a lot of road salts, those concentrations can go up. And, once chloride's in the lakes, it's, like, as I said, it's not really doing anything. So it does flush downstream, which is, does kind of solve our problem. The problem is that in many places we're still kind of actively putting more in than is flushing downstream, and so these concentrations are increasing. And so you can see here in some of these lakes, the concentrations have increased like 50-fold or 100-fold over the last, at this point, almost a century. And what we can do is like we can take all of the measurements that have ever been taken for chloride in lakes and rivers around the US. So these are obviously Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and we can take a look at if we see geographical patterns. So here, dark blue is pretty low, like less than 10 grams, less than 10 milligrams per liter of chloride. Over 500 is in bright green. And I think, what stands out to you is probably that these kind of high concentrations are concentrated in areas of like more urban settlement. So just more roads, interstates, people, and then the rural areas really are pretty close to natural background concentrations in a lot of places, which is great. That part's good. Um, and I know this looks like a lot of dots. Like you're like, oh, this data is great. We have a lot of information. Um, we do and we don't. There's a lot of, we have a lot of rivers and lakes in this area, and there's still a lot of sort of unknowns when it comes to what the background concentrations are. And then I think importantly, like, have they changed through time? So these maps really sort of average over like a couple decades of monitoring. And there's a lot of places where we have changed practices, and it's important to know, if we're making a difference. So being able to sort of resample similar systems through time gives us a really, a much better understanding of policy changes and things like that. Um, and to give you a sense of like what do these numbers mean, there are regulatory chloride thresholds, um, but set by the government for ecotoxicity. And in the United States, the EPA has a threshold of 230 milligrams per liter, is what they deem sort of a chronic threshold that will cause organismal harm. Canada's is lower. Canada's is 120. And then individual states will also sometimes have their own thresholds. So Wisconsin has one, it's actually higher. Um, and these thresholds do have regulatory importance, such that if you are monitoring a lake that has chloride concentrations higher than this, you get put on a list and have to come up with plans to try and reduce them. So these thresholds are useful. They're useful for regulatory purposes to say like this is really bad. But it's really hard to impose like a specific number on like when it's bad because it's it's bad for some organisms at really, really low concentrations, and other organisms, it's fine. So there's a lot of research pointing towards like these thresholds are actually pretty high, and that there's a lot of harm done at concentrations below these, especially in lakes in say like northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, where there like literally was like zero chloride in these lakes, kind of before humans. So, if you're interested in this as a topic, Wisconsin's been really, I think, like pretty progressive at trying to um, spread awareness and advocate for changing salt practices. And a lot of this is through municipal change. So, talking with like cities and counties about how much salt they use. And the reality is that road salt's gotten a lot more expensive over like every year. It gets more and more expensive. And so, as a state, we're spending tens of millions of dollars a year just purchasing salt. Like that's not even like paying the people to put it down or paying for the machines. It's like just purely purchasing the salt costs tens of millions of dollars. And so there's been a really, I think, fortuitous dovetailing between the economic reality of road salt and the environment, such that we've kind of actively reduced road salt use for both purposes. One, it helps the environment, protects our drinking water sources, and two, it saves a lot of money. If you can use a lot less salt, you save all that money. So if you are interested, I encourage you to look at this website. There's lots of cool information there about what people in Wisconsin are doing, and I know folks in Minnesota are doing a lot as well. So I'm gonna stop talking and happy to answer any questions. I see there's already one question there.